Many people connecting to audio from many countries, actually. Okay, Tom, are you ready to begin? Welcome to the Narrating the Holodomor, the social and cultural history of collectivization and famine in Ukraine. My name is Marta Bazouk, and I'm the Executive Director of the Holodomor Research and Education Consortium, better known as HREC. HREC is a project of the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies at the University of Alberta, with offices in Toronto. This conference is a long time in the making. We've been talking about it for a long time. Dr. Oksana Vinnik of HREC and CIUS has been instrumental from the very beginning, from the initial concept through the call for papers, the organization of the panels, communication with presenters, discussants, and chairs. So Oksana, congratulations, the day has come and the conference is about to begin. I would like to take this moment to thank the Temerté Foundation. HREC was founded in 2014 through the generous funding of Jim Temerté and his family foundation. And since that time, HREC has worked to expand the study and understanding of the Holodomor through a broad range of activities. And what we have been able to achieve would not have been possible without the ongoing support and generosity of James Temerté and his family. And more recently, we've been very fortunate to receive support from another family, the Helen and Paul Bashutsky family, and we're very excited about the possibilities that their generous support represents. I encourage anyone who'd like to know more about the activities of HREC to take a look at our website. It's an easy one, holodomor.ca, and there you can learn more about our work. And now it's my pleasure and honor to introduce Natalia Khinenko-Friesen. Dr. Friesen is the director of the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies and the Hutsalak Chair in Ukrainian Culture and Ethnography, Department of Modern Languages and Cultural Studies, both in the Faculty of Arts, University of Alberta. Her research interests include oral history, post-socialism in Europe and Ukraine, diasporic identities, labor migration, and Ukrainian-Canadian culture. She's the author of 2 monographs, Ukrainian Other Lands, Diaspora, Homeland, and Folk Imagination in the 20th Century. That's from University of Wisconsin Press. And Inchi Svit abo etnichnist, the Other World or Ethnicity in Action, Canadian Ukrainianness at the End of the 20th Century. She also is the co-editor of 3 collections, including Orality and Literacy, Reflections Across Disciplines, Reclaiming the Personal, Oral History in Post-Socialist Europe. Dr. Khinenko-Friesen is the founding editor of the Canadian journal Engaged Scholar Journal, Community Engaged Research, Teaching, and Learning. Her current book project has the working title, Decollectivized, The Last Generation of Soviet Farmers Speak Out. And I would just add that I'm very excited that she's our director because she has a longstanding interest in the Holodomor. She was responsible for ensuring that valuable interviews conducted by William Knoll and a team of ethnographers in his book Transformacja Hromadянського суспільства, that these valuable rare interviews are available online. And her commitment to this field is unwavering. And with that, I would like to give the floor to Natalia Khinenko-Friesen.
Marta, thank you so much for your wonderful introductions. Everybody, welcome to this important international symposium. Allow me first to bring my greetings as a director to all in the room. On behalf of the Institute of Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, I'm very pleased to welcome all to this very important scholarly forum. Established in 1976, the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies is dedicated to the production, preservation, and dissemination of expert knowledge about Ukraine and Ukrainians and their place in the world. So for the last 45 years, we have been leading and mobilizing the field of Ukrainian studies outside of Ukraine, but also working with Ukraine, enabling very many important and impactful conversations around pivotal moments in Ukrainian history, culture, society, and communities around the world. And this leadership role is especially evident when it comes to the field of the Holodomor studies, and the role HREC has been playing in spearheading its rapid evolvement, especially over the last 8 years. So I want to thank HREC for inviting me to deliver this presentation as a way of opening this important conference, Narrating the Holodomor. Anthropologists by their trade are expected to offer some disclaimers of who they are, what they do, and why, and I shall be no exception. So a cultural anthropologist and oral historian with a sustained focus on Ukraine. I'm not a researcher of the Holodomor. I am someone, though, with over the 3 decades of experience working and documenting personal life stories in Ukraine, and specifically with rural Ukrainians, wherever they live now, all against the background of the ongoing multidimensional sociocultural change that has been affecting this country and its people in the last 30 or so years. Today, I'd like to reflect on how and in what ways and why the memory of the Holodomor, and in broader sense, the memory of hunger, continues to pulsate, that is, resurface again and again in personal accounts, despite all kinds of social pressures working against its multi-generational continuity. The pressures I refer to as layers of forgetting here. This is in no way an exhaustive examination of all possible ways such continuity persists, but rather an exploration of how personal narratives do both retain and at the same time obscure such memory. As historians all know, our research and its findings, I say historical research and its findings, observations and conclusions are inevitably communicated in a narrative form. Narrative conventions dictate the way we communicate about the past and the way others receive and process what we want to share and say. This grip of narrative on the ways much of the history has been written has been indeed very powerful, as many scholars, including Hayden White, for example, in the ages, have been reminding us. So we should continue paying attention to the relationship between the past, the historical narrative, and the expectations of the time in which these narratives are produced. But aside from our ideological intentions to represent the past the way it suits us, there are also narrative conventions that affect our intended representations. The logic of the narrative imposes its own order and form on the events and happenings it describes. And these do differ from the order and the nature of the events in real life, as we, of course, know. The Narrating Holodomor conference, I have no doubt, will shed more light on the politics of historical representation and the interplay between, on one hand, scholarly, public, and artistic discourses on the famine, and on the other hand, Holodomor realities in the course of events. Today, in the context of heated debates in the field about who is wrong and who is right, who has the right and who doesn't to issue final authoritative statements on what was the Holodomor, this conference is a much needed podium for the respectful and methodologically grounded exchange on the matter. In my presentation, before you, dear conference participants, dive in the particulars on how the Holodomor has been narrated across different contexts, I wanted to return to these narratives that are the very core, that are at the very foundation of the Holodomor studies, personal accounts and testimonies. And specifically, I want to touch upon an important relationship between personal narrative, communal or social history, and the historical times in which personal accounts are produced or have been produced, as this relationship manifests itself in personal accounts of trauma and traumatic historical past most vividly. And in the Holodomor studies, it is an important relationship indeed to consider, as first person's accounts have been serving the field as key and primary sources of information from the onset of the Holodomor research Either we see it beginning even in the 30s or somewhere in the 50s, or maybe later in the 80s. It's all up to interpretation when the field had emerged as such. And in different times, these accounts were shared in writing and orally, individually, and in response to researchers and journalists' queries, but always intentionally. They became publicly available in the West first. Personal letters were first such accounts, written still in a time when Holodomor was taking place and unfolding. Letters were followed by survivor testimonies that began to appear soon thereafter, and especially after the World War II, when the wave of the Soviet refugees began to settle in the West again. In the second part of the 20th century, we began seeing the emergence of personal memoirs, that flow of autobiographical remembering. It was not until 1990s and after the collapse of the Soviet Union that the entire new corpus of personal testimonies of the Holodomor began to emerge in independent Ukraine. Altogether, the scope and volume of personal testimony materials and the whole field of its production is quite sizable. As for eyewitness personal letters, for example, that were published by Western media, as my dear colleague Serge Tsipko recently shared with me, back in the 30s, community members such as Mennonite community and Ukrainian Canadian community stakeholders spoke of thousands of letters received during the days of the tragedy. David Toves, for example, of the Mennonite board in Roston, Saskatchewan, wrote in Saskatoon Star Phoenix in February 1933, that the Mennonite community had been receiving on average 100 letters a day from the Soviet Union. And some days we have seen as many as 500. And yet another letter to a different journal, Edmonton Journal, in April 1933, Mr. Plavyuk wrote that thousands of letters had been received by Ukrainian Canadians in the fall of 1932, asking not for money, but for grain and flour. Collections of testimonies continued and offered us further insight into how personal testimonies were produced and how they were gathered in, again, the West after the World War II, containing, again, possibly thousands of these testimonies. Many of you in the room know far better than I do the scope of particular that body of testimonies. Bogdan Klit with his work on the Select Committee on Communist Aggression of the US House of Representatives that produced such. Olga Andreevsky, who had spent time in analyzing the collection of interviews held in the Harvard Project on the Soviet social system, are here to perhaps offer more insights on the body and the contents of these collections. With respect to personal memoirs, I'm personally unaware at this point if anyone is exploring that field in broadest sense possible in a systemic way, examining the scene of autobiographical memory production. I am aware of a work, for example, by Oksana Keys, who uses this genre of vernacular reflectivity, if you wish, in her work, and analyzed such sources to examine women experiences of the Holodomor. It is a popular genre of vernacular personal reflectivity in various diasporic communities, and it would be important to examine how autobiographic memory addresses the topic of the Holodomor in somewhat broader conceptual terms as well. But by far the most numerous body of witness testimonies, as we know, was recorded in independent Ukraine. We had 30 years or so to work on that particular collection exercise. We know, and those scholars are amongst presenters at the conference, for example, Veselova and Borek, offered us already some good overviews of the scope and level of oral historical research pursued in Ukraine. In 2015, Borek mentions that the number of the Holodomor-focused oral testimonies collected as part of various oral historical projects in Ukraine surpassed 20,600. And also she references general claims that stating that the number of that particular body of testimony can be in the range of 200,000. I'm sure the calculations continue on as work in oral history continues in Ukraine today. The Holodomor researchers are well familiar with such seminal works, of course, which have been coming as a result of oral historical work in Ukraine. We all know the seminal volume, Народна книга Holodomor by Maniak and his colleagues, which has come out in 1991. Many other methodologically sound collections on the Holodomor oral histories were recorded in Ukraine's south and southeast, specifically by the Zaporizhia School of Oral History, by scholars like Liman, Konstantinova, and others. Outside of professional research settings, many other collections have been produced, of course, at local, regional, and oblast levels, and I cannot do justice accounting for all that amazing and rich body of work which has been coming out there. In today's Ukraine, of course, oral history enjoys undeniable popularity as both a key method to document the legacy of the Holodomor, but also as a popular research practice. It is actively promoted at all levels, ranging from professional academics to local community historians. And this work, interestingly, of course, is broad and is being pursued for a number of reasons, different reasons. Let me elaborate briefly on some. The most commonly stated goal to conduct oral historical work is to gather evidence and to document facts and details that eventually became seen as indisputable. Other scholars collect and produce oral historical evidence as proof of the genocidal nature of the Holodomor. Veselova, in her overview of that work, oral historical work and the entire body of this practice, comments that oral history collected in Ukraine thus far undoubtedly confirms that the Holodomor was a genocide of the Ukrainian people. Of course, many other scholars follow in the same streak and Wayne and other names such as Stanislav Kulchitsky, Borisenko, and entire research institutes are also working towards that goal while analyzing and collecting oral evidence in their projects. But then scholars also revisit oral historical projects to conduct cross-examination of oral historical versus archival sources, to confirm or dispute validity and reliability of the existing archival documentation. Thus, Boric is interested in the correlation and correspondence between the archival documentation, however few documents have survived the archival genocide, as she puts it, and oral history sources themselves. It is a methodologically sound and important approach to explore. Yet another cohort of scholars engages with oral history in independent Ukraine to explain how larger than Holodomor, large-scale sociocultural and political transformations of the 20th century have been affecting or had affected people, families, and communities on the ground. These kinds of projects did not focus on the Holodomor only, but looked at larger contexts of people's lives, the community lives as well. Marta has mentioned William Knoll's work, which was published in 1999. William Knoll and his team conducted, for example, in the early 90s, fieldwork across the Ukraine with the focus on the generation of the Holodomor survivors themselves, talking to them about the life and community experiences, the way community and life had transformed prior, during, and after collectivization of the Ukrainian farmers in late 20s and through the early 30s. I wanted to bring up a different research, again, which doesn't focus on the Holodomor, but done by a non-Ukrainian scholar, Anna Sternschnitz, who focused in her research on oral history of the Ukrainian Jews as well, recorded in the 2000s. Hundreds of the interviews Dr. Sternschnitz worked with also reflected on the experiences and the survival of the famine. And her respondents and narrators discussed at length how they made sense of these experiences in their lives thereafter. And then my own research, the fieldwork for which was conducted or concluded rather in 2010, focused on the collapse of the collective farming system in Ukraine, which and it resulted in the collection of about 180 interviews in 11 regions in Ukraine. And this particular project was conducted 25 years after the Knowles project. And it was actually, in the way I conceived this project, as a follow-up layer of research after William Knowles' team concluded their work. And the project documented the story of the children of the Holodomor survivors without necessarily focusing on the Holodomor as well. Other approaches outside of these I've just encountered also emerge as well, and they're of importance to me as a oral historian, but also as a folklorist by training. Recently, some scholars began paying attention to the textual or narrative dimensions of oral historical evidence. Hanna Kapustyan, amongst others, looks into the personal accounts from the perspective of their narrative organization and how personal stories are plotted and taken by the particular key themes which have been pushing the narratives forward as it came down to relating them in the interview setting and elsewhere. General fear, anonymous reports, decolonization, consciousness, torxin, resistance, hard winter, and many key themes are something that she discusses in her work as narrative elements. Her research focuses indeed on narrative representations of the Holodomor experiences. And at that point, I'm reminded of other body of work which takes narrative representations and works with them very carefully. This kind of research I'm referring to is the one which focuses on intergenerational transmission of trauma from the Holodomor. And we have seen a couple of very substantial projects recently developed and produced in Ukraine. These researchers, accounting for the whole range of factors, distance in 2 or 3 or more generations between the narrators and the victims of the Holodomor, lasting Soviet rule, and also I would add myself an unfinished post-communist transition. So in the lieu of all that, the scholars are discussing in rather methodologically sound ways the lasting impact of the Holodomor on the families and following generations of the survivors' families. The study of about 100,000 survivors, which is not finished or wasn't finished until a few years ago, conducted by Voropaeva and a Pushny team in 2009, started that trend perhaps. Then we know the work by Bezo and Maggie, who worked with 15 families and 45 respondents or individuals, and they've published their findings in 2015 in different venues. Then we have a team of Gorbunova and Klimchuk, whose work was recently profiled in one of the journals by the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, who worked and conducted survey with 721 individuals, again, focusing on the ways intergenerational trauma and memory is being transmitted. All these studies are an example of a sustained scholarly examination of this cross-generational transmission of trauma and also of memory. I do want to point out, though, a couple of important factors that unite these lot of projects I just brought up. In all cases above, researchers actively sought out personal accounts of intergenerational memory of the Holodomor trauma. All studies by default of what they were to focus on, indeed focused on loss, trauma, and or on inability to overcome the sense of victimhood. The important dimension of their work for my case is the following. As interviews were generated in response, and survey responses as well, they were generated in response to researchers' interests, specifically in the Holodomor memories, we cannot discard the presence of potential catering to the expectations of researchers by the narrators, however unintentional it may be. And I'm bringing this up as an anthropologist and ethnographer, working out of the field of ethnography and anthropology, in which researchers are expected to carefully account for potential influence that the research agenda can have on how narrators frame their accounts and answers and reminiscences about their personal lives and past. Apart from psychological dimensions of intergenerational transmission of trauma, though, in what other ways does memory about traumatic past travel down along the generational lines? Let us consider the impact of oral history as a cultural practice on that process, as well as oral historical narratives, as though that do have also impact on personal, familial, and community memory transmission. As many scholars of oral history point out, one of the most effective ways for memory to be retained in the next generation is through sustained and continued storytelling. This is a given understanding of the field. Oral historians agree upon the idea that stories and storytelling possess unique power to communicate key messages in the most convincing and emotionally engaging ways. Stories reach our minds and our hearts far more effectively than any other kind of narrative. In Families of the Holodomor Survivors, Bezo and Gorbunova's teams observed the direct link between the lack of awareness and family memory of the Holodomor and the lack of storytelling. This lack is being explained either by the degree of suffering. The more family members suffered, the less storytelling took place in the families. That's the observations and claim Gorbunov and Klinchaks are proposing, or by the hostile political climate that overall suppressed personal and social memory about the Holodomor, something that the Bezo team is advancing as their argument. Thus, when it comes to this question of how memory travels across generations and how forgetting works, the reasons brought up by these scholars touch upon an important relationship between narrative, memory, but also the issue of forgetting. Forgetting as that social resistance to memory retention, as documented in oral historical research, can profoundly affect the generation of witnesses themselves. And such forgetting has its roots not only in the ability or inability of the individual to retain the memory on her own due to whatever physiological, psychological factors. It can be unintentional and socially constructed at the same time. And importantly, the social construction of memory and forgetting is affected by the very ways the narrative operates, oral narratives operate, oral accounts work. And how do story and storytelling maintain memories of the past in memory of trauma? A famous Italian scholar, oral historian, and one of the founding fathers of contemporary theoretical perspectives on oral history, Alessandro Portelli, was long interested in the interplay of oral history, personal memory, and the historical context in which stories are being exchanged. In his most influential work, The Death of Luigi Trastulli, Portelli revisits a particular incident from his oral historical practice, a case study that long ago became one of the most famous and classical texts in oral history of the 20th century. Luigi Trastulli, a 21-year-old steel worker from the city of Terni, an industrial town in Umbria, Italy, died in a clash with the police on March 17, 1949, as workers walked out of the factory to attend a rally against signing of the North American Treaty of the Italian government. The clash and the killing lasted mere 30 minutes, but the memory of this brief episode took a life of its own, shaping town's identity, culture, and its historical memory, as well as the memory of the same generation of workers as Trastulli himself. What is unique about this story about Luigi Trastulli is that his death was soon thereafter misremembered by the entire generation of steel workers who continued on to fight for their rights in the following decades and who also participated in all kinds of other battles of their own. The error that many other respondents made when reflecting on their own lives and political struggles concerned the shift of the date and context of the Luigi's death from 1949 to 4 years later, from NATO rally to the street fighting that followed massive layouts of some 2,000 people, the event which in fact is the formative event in the memory of that generation of steel workers. Fast forward to the mid-80s when Portelli turned to researching the history of Terni labor movement, interested in the workers' perspective on it. The scholar interviewed for his project hundreds of workers who convincingly claimed that Trastulli not only died in 1953, but he was also a key figure in a traumatic event of that particular clash. Intrigued by this continued narrative pushing of the deaths from 49 to 4 years later, Portelli moved on to discuss in his book the importance and relevance of such individual misrepresenting and social forgetting, if you wish, to the construction of historic memories. Portelli thus turns his attention exactly to the workings of such oral historical memory and to the ways oral personal narratives transformed and reordered the events and happenings that took place in different settings. He called these displacement and condensation, and again, oral history has taken it on as a theoretical field and had elaborated immensely on these means of memory reworking. The most remarkable phenomena in the collective remembrance of Trastuli's death concern how individual narratives merged the two most dramatic events of Turney's post-war history into one coherent story that made the most sense to those who have narrated it. To bridge these events in meaningful and important to the narrator's form, the narrators utilized other strategies, of course, and he goes to discuss those as well, such as narrative shifts and modes of narration, the vertical shift, which allowed the narrators to move with ease between personal and political, societal and collective and individual. And also then there's a conversation about that important horizontal shift, which had been responsible for that push of events along and this reshuffling of the events along the chronological lines into the directions that served personal memory and personal purpose of self-expression. Thus, as Portelli shows us, oral history accomplishes both tasks. It provides to a degree some information about the past. It does reflect on facts. But as a living medium of historical representation, oral history especially highlights what kind of memory the community, in Portelli's case, of the steel workers of that town of Turney, what kind of memory the community needs today in the moment the narration takes place. At the same time, the researcher offered us an insight in how personal accounts of the past are framed by the very genre of oral history and its narrative means. In my analytical work pertaining to oral history, I also focus on both possibilities and limitations personal narrative imposes on the way we remember and the way we forget, and how memory is verbalized in the interviews when we are recording those. At this point, I've tried to share a few slides. If I'll be able to, that would be great. And allow me to try to do that. Am I sharing?
Natalia, yes, we see your slide.
But am I able to control that? Okay. And just give me a second. Okay, so we are. Yes. So about some 10 years ago on my sabbatical in Ukraine, I coordinated an oral history project that aimed to explore the collapse of the collective farming in Ukraine in the 90s. The project, as I've mentioned, generated about 170 extensive live history interviews that were recorded in 11 oblasts in regions in Ukraine. The project was not actively seeking personal or family memories of the Holodomor. Therefore, we did not select people who remembered the Holodomor the best or well. As a result, this particular research did not generate extensive accounts of what the experience of the famine were like. The children of the Holodomor survivors were exposed to their own experiences of hunger and privation, and those experiences reinforced the family members of the Holodomor, and at times they took over, making it all such memories a strong continuum. Nonetheless, the interviews demonstrated the connection between the Holodomor and the way the generation of the survivors' children constructed their understandings of themselves, their own life stories. The Holodomor and their accounts was the starting point that informed and triggered the chain of later privations. Rarely the narrators, though, engaged in storytelling or sharing some details about their own family losses during the Holodomor. That they conversely referred actually to that experience as the first famine. It is a starting point in this generation's light of other privations, other hungers, of which they've actually mentioned more than two, more than 1947, for example, more than that. And right, so Rarely narrators engage that they conversely referred it to the first famine. And instead of memories of 1932 and 33, coupled with memories of privation in the war, in the famine of 1947, and actually some other further smaller hunger or they've experienced in their personal settings in some villages around Ukraine. These all accounts merged into one meta experience of hunger and privation. And this particular merged experience informed practically all interviews, pulsating in life histories as an inner narrative stream that kept moving the life history forward. Remembering was not focused on facts, but it was weaving all the accounts and all the experiences, nevertheless and nonetheless, into a coherent story. What is important to point out, though, is that while memories of hunger and privation were constantly coming to the surface of a life story throughout the entire narration, the overall outcome and message that the narrators shared most commonly was not the message of victimhood or suffer, but the message of personal perseverance, survival, and personal accomplishments. In my book, I am discussing indeed how memories of hunger and privation were countered by memories of joy for life in collective farming systems, by positive experiences altogether generating highly layered, complex, and contradictory portrait of that generation of farmers in the end. Recently, rereading, listening to, and coding the entire corpus of interview transcripts brought me into the very midst of storytelling events that the interviews were. Each time I turned to a particular voice, I would re-enter the space and time of a conversation that took place somewhere in the late 2000s in 50 villages across Ukraine. I became witness to these voices and narrative choices villages were making to share their past. Immersed in the discursive world of village stories, I soon noticed some commonalities in wordings villages relied on across all interviews. Certain words and phrases were repeated regularly, became an observable plane of narrative data in life story interviews, and their frequent use by the villages was begging for attention. It is in this particular context that I realized how consciously villages were using them, how explicit their choosing of words had been. Owing to my training in folklore studies, I did become interested in examining these closer. Once I realized what words and phrases were commonly used for these terms, I ran frequency tests across all corpus of recorded narrative, consisting of more than 1,060,000 words. Searches had to be conducted in Ukrainian, Russian, Crimean Tatar languages, and all kinds of methodological hurdles had to be overcome in order to capture that whole narrative data. As life in the kolkhoz has been constantly managed from the outside and subject to frequent and at times abrupt change, I expected the narrators to rely on some evolving sets of keywords in their stories, from privations towards better life eventually, from memories of poverty and hunger towards memories of that, literally joyful life in late socialism times. I expected the narrators to, and they didn't, yet not in a linear, they did rely, but not in a linear or progressive fashion, as I just mentioned, from poverty to prosperity, hunger to eating enough, but rather in oscillatory, a circular manner. Most common expressions evolved around, of course, core tropes, cold and hungry, holodny, holodny, naked and barefoot, misfortune, but also around, just let me go to the next image so we can be on the same page, but also around such tropes as joyfully, normalcy, singing, and I will also look at the way breath was being discussed. For example, key phrases containing words deriving from hunger occurred in all transcribed interviews 319 times. Remember, we were not focusing on memories of the Holodomor, but asking people about their life stories, so the choices were there. The Holod was encountered 146 times, joy, veseli or veselo, 187 times, pisni and spivare was very brought up, like singing and song was part of that vocabulary set of happiness, and mentioned about 197 times. But importantly, and actually something I did not expect myself, but eventually understood why, The word "chlieb" was used in significantly larger number of contexts in all interviews, 654 times. There's no single interview that does not use most or all. In fact, all interviews have used, for what I remember, all interviews relied exactly on these tropes, each in their own way, to convey the personal narratives and make them go forward. Though this generation lived through extreme hunger and poverty in younger years of their lives, the memory of these experiences, whether they were personal or familial, emerged as foundational. For these experiences informed villagers' lifelong understandings of what was normal and what was extreme. It is not surprising that such staple sayings, "Holodni ta holodni" and "Holy and Bossy," continued to frame villagers' life narratives overall. Being young and hungry was a frequent topic of conversation for practically all participants. In those cases when hunger was part of the personal experience, the narrators would share their personal accounts. When the narrator did not experience extreme hunger as much as others did, hunger still served as a bleak background to their own lives, and thus was actively referenced in their stories as a group experience. In the first place, these tropes were used to frame the privations of childhood and post-World War Reconstruction period. Secondly, the tropes of hunger and cold were brought up throughout the entire narrative in some cases, and that, as I've mentioned, was a framing of the way of framing the entire story. And thirdly, the saying "cold and hungry," for example, was used oftentimes in the context of such as "we were not cold and hungry." That was used as a strong evaluative tool, again, to reflect back on all kinds of other periods of a person's life, and also to justify one's overall life in the kolkhoz as a good life. Villagers oftentimes phrased their comments along the lines, "Life was good, we did not go hungry," thus underlying the asserted normalcy of their lives against the background of earlier privations and against the background of their current decollectivized lives, speaking of the context in which interviews were recorded. In this case, the trope "cold and hungry" was evaluative and value ascribing. Applied in such manner, these revealed their core position in the narrative stock of narrative strategies, in the narrator's stock of narrative strategies, to communicate their life experiences, values, and views. While hunger was somewhat expected narrative frame for all narratives, the word "chlieb," the alter notion of hunger, was by far the most dominant trope. Bread served the villagers as a means to explain the word bread, to explain again one's childhood, but also one's entire life and one's generational makeup. It was featured again, as I said, many times in various contexts, languages, and forms. As most used wording strategy frequently oscillating between now and then, here and there, references to bread, along with other key tropes, framed and bracketed rural life narratives into a coherent story, revealing this generation's personal and social subjectivities. And it served narrators as a strategy, many purposes, of course. It was a direct reference pointing out directly to the shortages in earlier lives, periods of people's lives, especially in youth and childhood for that generation. Secondly, that trope was used metaphorically and poetically, of course, in all kinds of poetic and sayings and proverbs which were used throughout the interviews, in colloquial expressions, in contexts where the word bread also stood for, as a substitute, as a metaphor for grain, for earnings, for wealth, and so on and so forth. Thirdly, it emerged across the entire body of rural interviews as a pragmatic tool to measure and evaluate personal and communal rural well-being. Rural narrators frequently operated with bread quantitatively, if you wish. Entire periods of life were measured in terms of how much bread one had, or how little one had, how much one could buy or couldn't buy. Thus, describing younger years, again, narrators typically focused on how little bread they had, and so on and so forth. Their adult lives, when they reflected on them, these quantitative references in the context of presumably stable social, late socialism, as both seen by the narrators. Villages routinely measured their successes with references to that, 5 or 6 loaves per ruble, speaking of how much bread one can buy or one could buy back in Soviet times with stable pricing for it, right? And how far more expensive the bread had become in post-collectivization times. Retroactively, villages were appreciative, of course, how cheap and accessible bread was in their lives. And that expression had been again popping up in all interviews with slight variations, 5 loaves, 6 loaves, but nonetheless somewhere there. When conversation turned to post-decollectivization timed bread again would be that tool to quantitatively measure one's well-being, or rather deterioration of one's well-being, as villagers spoke about how expensive bread became. And these narrative oscillations between now and then were a most common way to invoke these references. It was constantly here and now, or then and here. Altogether, working through layers of memory, facing an audience with no experience in co-host living, who were there, who researchers were for these particular villages, and presented with rare opportunity to speak about themselves at length, villagers engaged in oftentimes novel to them life narrative work. For the most, the work they were doing was cultural and cross-generational translation. They were explaining their lives in complex and ambivalent times of post-decollectivization to the millennial Ukrainians. I started my talk today by asking the question in what ways memory of the Holodomor, in a broader sense, the memory of hunger, continues to manifest itself in personal accounts in generations following the survivors. How this memory is making its way up through various layers of forgetting. Engaging in autobiographical self-reconstruction, Ukrainian villagers, like steel workers of Terni, faced the universal psychological need to present their life stories and themselves in cohesive and coherent ways, not as losers, but as winners. The memory work that both groups were doing was governed by narrative possibilities and limitations, in addition to all kinds of circumstances, which you will be accounting for in the context of this conference. And these accounts may appear as being selective, evaluative, and maybe not fact-oriented. Oral historians remind us, while accounts of past events as communicated in oral history narratives cannot be seen as true memories or unquestionable representations of the past, oral history narratives nonetheless are shared as true accounts of someone's life. To the tellers, they possess narrative truths that may go against established understandings of what really happened in the past. Yet they point to the meanings narrators invest these personal pasts with. I'm reminded of James Young, who argued when examining narratives of traumatic experiences, that narratives of trauma witnesses carry on an ontological authenticity, though not necessarily a factual authority. It is this complexity of memory in work in personal accounts, its simultaneous narrative authenticity and lack of factual authority, that researchers in the Holodomor studies should pay close attention to. It is with much care and much consideration that we should be approaching other people's lives and other people's stories. It is with much care and consideration that we should be examining complex ways in which the memory of Holodomor may continue manifesting itself in the following generations. How many generations it may take for Ukrainians in Ukraine before the key memories of hunger and privation cease framing people's understandings and memories of themselves? Time will show. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Natalia, for a fascinating and necessary framing of the theme of our conference. I neglected to mention at the start that you can send your questions through the chat function, and I will be reading them out loud. Maybe I will get us started, Natalia. You were talking about the question of interference, that respondents consciously or not consciously meeting expectations of interviewers. I was wondering, in the case of something like the Manyak publication, on the one hand, a great deal of time had passed from the events. On the other, my guess is there was very little cross-pollination to solidify a narrative. People were not discussing it. And also there was a general call. Maybe you can say a few words about that. I'm for some people who may not be familiar with that project, but what are the challenge? On the one hand, I was thinking that it's a plus that obviously it's a horrible thing that people were not able to discuss and grieve and process, but for scholars today, what does that do to the value of that collection, that there was not a consolidation of a narrative as people were not able to discuss, write, study it for so long?
It's also reminds me of the work which was Noel did, his own experiences and his own interviews, like in Manek's collection, were not as comparable to what we may be recording nowadays when we go specifically into the field. But again, I like how you operated on one end with the word uncontaminated, and in the way you brought us back into the context of a time in which recordings have been taking place.
Did I use that word, contaminated?
I think you put it in the quotation mark, of course, and we're taking it as such. You definitely referred to a very important relationship, which we need to be accounting for when we are working with oral evidence and oral testaments, that the context of the time in which collections are gathered, or that the evidence is gathered, would very much impact the way the verbalization will take place in the narrative, in the interviews itself. Yes, on one end, we have these circumstances of political control, which lasted for so long, 50 plus or so, or 70 plus years, depending on the context, have certainly imposed upon several generations, as we've seen our psychologists confirming, inner limitations and fears on how to proceed. On the other hand, because there was no continued sustained practice of verbalization of these experiences, and that's where my take on narrative being impactful here comes in. Verbalization requires time for us to arrive at some coherent life stories and coherent accounts of some past. We need audiences. We need opportunities to exchange our and to have a dialogue with, and then in this case, memories can come back. So I think having these early collections is very important for us, because exactly they show us that 30 years ago, if we would go in a field and we'll start collecting the evidence, it will be packaged or shaped narratively, or in terms of verbalization, very differently. And interestingly enough, Marta, the interviews which I was working with, and they were recorded in 2000s, villagers themselves were continually used the tropes of Holodovka or Holodivka, or that is famine in English, rather than Holodomor. And if they would bring the Holodomor, they say famine, which is now known as Holodomor. So it hasn't yet been as solidified as a reference, even that time frame back about 11 years ago. So at least in the rural context. I hope I'm answering your question.
We have a question through the chat, and I think maybe you've given, did I just, no, I'm not, okay. You may have already given a partial answer, and it seems to be a more general question about the Holodomor and how well it is or isn't known. The question is, what would you say is the main reason that the Holodomor remained unknown and not taught for so many decades, and is only recently being considered for integration into K-16 world history curriculum as part of genocide awareness? Is it a lack of evidence? And this question seems to be more about unknown in Canada and in the West than about being undiscussed in Ukraine.
Thank you so much for this question. As I will preface it again, I'm as not the scholar of Holodomor, I would go back to the very complexity of and very layeredness or multi-layeredness of various reasons which are behind that. On one end, of course, we are, if we have to go back to the USSR, we understand in the political setting of the Soviet Union, there was no possibility whatsoever to sustain any memory, despite the fact, though, the personal settings allowed for some continuity of memory. Of course, villages do have some continuity of familial memory, there's genealogical memory, but if we are to talk about public discourse, public representations in awareness, there were none. The West, of course, on the other hand, had been much more effective at documenting, preserving, and maintaining this evidence. But as we know very well, and I'm facing right now, virtually facing those amazing scholars who have been behind mobilizing that discourse and knowledge about the Holodomor in the West. Nonetheless, this effort we are all undertaking in the field of the Holodomor studies to not publicize, but to make the public aware of the atrocities which were caused, competes with so many other narratives, which other constituencies, other powerful groups dealing with their own tragedies, with their own genocides, are advancing their messages at the same time in, if you wish, very tiny public discourse we all participate in. So not only we need to continue on collecting our own, collecting evidence, reflecting on that tragedy which struck Ukrainians and still has lingering effect, we also need to work against the currents, and not this is wrong word, Marta and everybody, but together with others to bring the discourse about the Holodomor and awareness about the Holodomor on par with other discourses which do better job at promoting, not promoting, but at publicizing, not publicizing, but making the world aware of what they do. So I would step with those two reasons. There's, of course, subtleties and details. Yeah, thank you so much for that question.
We are going to take the questions through chat primarily, but I will make a Frank Sisson exception. Frank, if you take yourself off mute, you could ask a question. Frank, you have your hand raised?
Am I unmuted? Yes, okay. The issues, I think, of interest are also the relation of oral history and other types of testimony, such as the Maniac letters, or above all, the early German letters. It seems to me, how much has the field dealt with the transfer from oral history to these kinds of generated immediate testimonies, and how they would be evaluated? So that's a much more general question. A comment on the interviewee wanting to have a structured narrative, and how much an interviewer can interfere. It was my experience, at least in Western Ukraine, that almost everyone wanted to talk about UPA, what had happened after the war, and to get them to go on another topic, you almost had to force them. So how does the field view this kind of directing to the topic you want? And then the final is, would you comment on gender, the difference between male and female narratives in your work?
How to direct, just give me a second. So 3 questions, Frank. I may not remember them all, so let's start with the first. The challenge of oral history as a tool in humanities and social sciences research is well acknowledged, exactly along those lines, how complicated it is sometimes to bring in what has been related orally into a field which predominantly functions in a different mode of expressing ideas. It's a like literally field, it's academic field, it structures ideas and presents them in a completely different way, rather than a person reminiscing about his or her life, doing it for the first time does. So there's a huge significant research done exactly on that idea of translation, which also is to be done between the way messaging is packaged in orally and the way we want to do justice by bringing it and literally translating into in the written discourse. So that's this to start with. I'll give you an example. Some respondents in my experience, and those would be more commonly rural Ukrainians than my experience working with interviewees in the Western setting, presented with the need to reflect on something. What they're doing at the same time, they're actually facing many tasks at the same time. First, it's remembering. Second, it's actually trying to verbalize it to someone who normally they perceive as not being part of their milieu, someone who doesn't understand that. And third is to package it in such ways that this receiver will understand. So it's, in some ways, we're talking about this triple work, which needs to happen in the same space and time of as long as the verbalization unfolds. So this is immense psychological pressure on a person. So we need to remember that as well. Secondly, these continuous oscillations between here and now are sometimes extremely difficult to plow through. If you are to pick up a transcript, and you may have done that yourself, and this transcript indeed is based on oral exchange between a person who's never done this work and an interviewer who is doing a good job by not interfering, the transcript would be, you cannot follow it unless you understand the principles and you know how to unpackage and respectfully and ethically without changing the message to present it all in a written way. So there's a lot of translation goes there. I am beginning now, I'm only now beginning to look in the letters as a genre altogether. And I would love to eventually know how letters have been crafted and how they will be analyzed. And I hope someone is doing this work maybe with the narrative analysis of letters. So I'll stop it here saying there's a huge undertaking there to take what is being communicated orally and to make it coherent and well crafted for perception in writing. Your second question about us trying to get to the point of what we want to discuss, if we're to continue on discussing oral historical interviews. You made me smile when you mentioned your experiences in Western Ukraine, that as soon as you want to explore the topic, local folks tend to go back to UPA and World War II, post-World War II experiences in Western Ukraine. This was exactly my experience as well. How do we go about that? By investing time, building relationships, and spending more, in returning to our respondents and our narrators again, once they exhaust their topic, their hot tomato topic of UPA, they will be willing and prepared to work with you on a different topic. This is anthropologist in me speaking about oral historical work. When we do oral history and anthropology, we come from that perspective of necessarily of us being in the field being as a necessity for longer than just for one interview only. And I've tried to do that. I had return visits to communities where the project has taken place, and I've come back to maintain some relationships, not all of them. And the last question, I think, concerned the gender. It's a very important and big question. And currently I'm working on the book, and I'm now struggling with how to, in fact, reflect on the work of gender in the way gender works and affects the outcome in memories and narratives of the villages when they are to speak about their lives. First of all, the living worlds of rural Ukrainians throughout the entire times of that period I'm researching, and my research does begin in concerns the late 30s, and focuses on time unfolding after the World War II, especially. We're talking about two different gendered communities altogether, and the fact that we are the fact that two gendered communities had pursued two different lives. Sure, they've interacted, sure, they've overlapped, but the collective system have not done much to really bridge, some gaps between the genders and men and women and how they experience their lives. Throughout the socialist system, both men and women continued on to really maintain their connected but different universes. They were connected, of course, by all means. It does remind me of some other anthropological research done elsewhere outside of Ukraine, where in some settings, in feudal times, or anyways, this was the case. Surprisingly, it had continued to last in Soviet times as well. What I'm coming at to, Frank, is that because of the lived experience of men and women in rural villages, the ways they were talking about their lives were also different. Partially because content was different, but also framing was different. I've noticed, at least in interviews of ours in my project, how that men were much more commonly attempting to put an emphasis on how normal life was and how they would be overall more brisk and more harsh in their judgments of one kind of political discourse or the other that would be involved. While women typically would also adopt a slightly different perspective and slightly different person, a narrator's voice. Instead of saying I, women would commonly say we, meaning we as family, we as a cohort, the lanka, the squad, or we as milkmaids in the farm, and so on and so forth. So there's this discrepancy in self-positioning of I and we. There's a tone difference. There's difference in particular means the narrators were using. Women were far better in litanies. If you follow that line of thought and think of folklore, what litany stands for, the women are very, very good at putting their narratives in a litany-like way. And I am actually still trying to figure out how to speak about that difference in the book. So I'm thankful for the question to be asked.
We have some more questions coming in through the chat. Oh, the chat disappeared for a second. Yuri Kaparulin says, thank you for a great presentation. Would you comment on stratification of the memoirs you collected according to ethical principle, maybe ethnic, Ukrainian Jews, Crimean Tatars, and others? If there is one, can you discuss the experiences? How are they distinguished in memoirs of different groups?
Thank you for your question. I am very appreciative of you specifically zooming in on the topic of the memoirs, but unfortunately, I don't really have much to say about that, because this is exactly what I'm pointing out. We need to do work on that. I am aware, and I've been paying attention as a person who is interested in vernacular cultures and cultural expressions and narrative positionalities, which are trapped between literary genres and folklore genres. That's where the memoirs, in my opinion, fall. I know the body is growing. I know of individual collections. I know occasional scholars are using them. I think I've mentioned Oksana Keys in this case, but I haven't had an opportunity to compare personally the way perhaps different ethnic groups will reflect on those. I think, and I know there is, in Ukraine though, there is a very strong work happening right now on locating and finding such documents, personal memoirs throughout the countryside as well. My next route would be to go there for my own sake and explore that. Thank you.
Bogdan Klid has a question for you. Could you comment on the fear factor in oral history sources? It's known that some who gave testimonies in the West during the Cold War period requested anonymity, fearing reprisals against family members. When the first testimonies were being collected in the late 1980s and early 90s in Ukraine, people were not subject to severe repressions for providing testimonies, but fear still did play a part in how people interviewed responded to questions. Or that might have been a question. I'm sorry, that was a question. Did fear still play a part in how people interviewed responded? If so, how is that reflected?
Thank you, Bogdana. It is an important, again, point to bring up, because indeed I can confirm, and I see that indirectly fear manifests itself. If I say in a second-hand way, that's probably a very impolite way of putting it. But let me put it this way: working with the rural narrators and rural folks living in Ukraine and being interviewed in their 70s and literally being the children of the generation of the survivors. There would be references in their stories about how basically genealogical memory stalled with the generation of their parents. As I said, in the context of our interviews, rarely informants, or rather narrators, spoke about memories of their own parents. Rather, they would cite, communal memories rather than their own. And they immediately would comment how sad it is that they were, or how they would acknowledge that their parents were not talking, they were not sharing those stories, they were silent. So in this case, the silence or the fear to speak, which translates into this very rather fancy, actually theoretical word silences in oral narratives, which oral historians are very effectively operate with and consider it to be an important element of an important grammar element, if you wish, in a grammar of narrative. So it's very important to remind ourselves that we should not discard it as well. So these silences have traveled up through a generational line and blocked memory transmission in one way. Whether the villages themselves continued to have fears, some did, and some were more relaxed, depending on the age. Those in their 70s, somehow the age difference in 10 years was noticeable when it came down to that particular generation of people. I did mention in my slides, I didn't say about the years of their being born, between 36, I believe, and 51. So of course, earlier, those who were born earlier would still continue on in the fashion of their parents. And those who were born after the war or were a bit more relaxed about these heavy memories. Thank you.
The next question is related to what you've just been speaking about. Are the stories of the Holodomor in Ukraine that come from elders different from the stories of children who lived through the Holodomor? The difference between narratives from different age groups. The questionnaire goes on. Usually there are generational differences when people of different ages relate their experiences.
Well, it's absolutely true. First, we're talking about severe traumatic experiences, and those who have experienced severe trauma, as we've seen confirmed by the work of these psychology teams of psychologists working to explain how trauma travels. So those people who have been affected by immediate experiences of trauma, and those who are placed in a very hostile political environment, which does not allow to process trauma, have follow different routes, most commonly suppression of memory. So that's to continue on with this line, whether memories would come up or not. We although know that in not hostile environments, social environments, when people are allowed and welcome to feel welcome to share their experiences, processing trauma and speaking about that is the only way towards some sort of personal resolution and some sort of a way moving forward. This is what has been especially noticeable, that the whole entire generation, and more than one, has been deprived of this opportunity to verbalize the traumatic experiences. The second generation, which is the children's generation, my project targeted, and as I said, my project was not focusing on experiences of Holodomor, so there's this correlation to be taken into consideration as well. There was less of a traumatic take on what was going on, in a sense. In fact, it's not very true. People actually, some broke down in tears when they were remembering the atrocities and the deaths which had affected their families. And there were stories of cannibalism, there were stories of disappeared children, there were stories, very moving and very painful stories, how mothers had to give up their children and bring them to the cities, and the known stories to all of us. But what is important is how those stories are related. Those people who were able to actually put it in a story were able to communicate it in an emotionally very rich and an emotionally very moving way, and in a way which also has released them, because that was an opportunity to speak and share that. So interviewee interviewers, working in the context of oral history, are so keenly aware that they oftentimes take over the role of a psychologist, if you wish, right? To when they work with people of trauma, they have to be really properly trained to do this work and to make sure reminiscences are coming out in the fullest possible way, but also it's not harmful to an individual to go that route and re-trigger the trauma. So yes, there was difference between the generations, and profound one. Last point I'll have to add here, I didn't have a chance to talk about that, but in my work on this project and elsewhere, I do differentiate between such things as narration, accounting out loud in a context, sort of putting out those stories in some sort of coherent way, and also narrativization. And narrativization is what the second generation is better at doing, because they have had time, distance, and now they're in much more non-hostile environment, social environment, and able to reflect upon that. So narrativization refers to what happens to the stories when they get retold, when they get polished, when they get shaped, and when they get finally solidified as a piece, if you wish, of not folklore, but as a piece which has a repeated presence in people's lives, also as perhaps a folk tale, similar to how folk stories could function in times of they being retold. So there's also that difference between narration, which is told, which is full of silences and soaking in fear, and therefore very brisk and very concise, versus other accounts which can be more executed in the form of narrativized accounts, because these stories have circulated and were shared before the researchers have come and collected them. Thank you so much.
Yeah, as you were speaking, I was thinking about what the ultimate sort of extension of this narrativization is. You take a film like Schindler's List, I'm sure you could read a one-page summary of the events around that story, but by the time it's been retold and reimagined and dramatized, it becomes a story. I guess I say that just to say that it's not in any way to demean or minimize these experiences, to call them, that they become stories. It just speaks to their power. We have a question from Roman Serbin. What do the narratives that you've encountered tell us about how did people understand Stalin and his regime's main motives in submitting Ukrainians to the Holodomor?
Anna Romana, thank you for this question. Depends. Overall, I'm just trying to reflect in those couple of seconds. I'm stalling here speaking. I'm just trying to revisit the 1,060,000 words which I was referring to, and try to just pull that sort of a set of references out and remember how profound or not it was. I will say that there was no singling out of Stalin as the main perpetrator or main someone who should be first and above blamed for what had happened. And also, we need to account for some regional differences. Some interviews were conducted in eastern Ukraine, in Kharkiv and Oblast. Others were conducted in the south. And there was also western Ukraine we've covered with our project. So you can obviously see how the impact of and legacy of the Soviet system and Soviet rule and Soviet discourses on how people would speak and discuss their experiences. Obviously, we would have more critical take on Stalin's very, very, of course, obvious in the West, and far more gentle take on Stalin. And sometimes, there were admirers of Stalin in Eastern Ukraine as well, who, of course, would not link these two experiences whatsoever. The most commonly, as I've mentioned, the work which the narrators were primarily doing, because they were asked to tell their life stories, they were focused on communicating to the young researchers that despite all these deprivations and experiences of horrific experiences they have went through in the eyes of ours as outsiders, they all persevered, they all have come out. So their focus was on something else altogether. Their focus was not on being victim, not on revisiting the past trauma as much as on how, despite all the odds, they've succeeded. This is the most strongest message that was communicated in the course of these interviews. And yet at the same time, these very interviews were filled with memories and reminiscences about very negative experience of collective farming and of course, including the hunger and deprivations of early lives as well. Ultimately, when it came to assigning blame for Holodomor to someone, mostly was Soviet system and Soviet rulers. Some had said Stalin, but not as much as probably we might have expected or, projected.
We have a question from Amelia Glaser. Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. I'm very interested in the ways that people of later generations talk about tragedies in relation to one another. And so I'm curious as to whether any of your respondents evoked other traumas. As points of comparison in discussing the Holodomor. Do they explicitly compare the Holodomor to the Holocaust or to the Armenian genocide? And I would just add to that, and do they look at it, do they talk about World War II in the same breath, or is it just one unending series of crises and traumas in there, or do they separate?
Thank you very much for this question. Absolutely, it's an important one to consider. I did point out that villages reflected about the Holodomor in the terms of that first famine. So that first famine, in their course of their lives, they have lost in the way access to the memories of their parents, or they've lost their parents or aunts and uncles and so on and so forth. Some haven't, of course, but they also have lost the memory of maybe, and they were not going as far into history as going to 1920s, but it's not universal. Some did. So the important dimension I had to undertake when working on my project is that I had to take a perspective on the villages, and the one which was framed by the understanding that history is experienced by generations. History is discussed by generations because of how we as human beings evolve and go through phases of life, from our formative years to our post-formative years to the times in where we are ready to recollect and reminiscent and project, build projections in our lives overall. For this generation, which were born immediately after the Holodomor, formative years have happened to be, for some, World War II, but also 1947, collectivization in Western Ukraine, and interestingly, other famines, as villages in Eastern Ukraine were referring to some sporadic local periods in which they were truly starving in the 50s as well. This is your kukurudza season and around those times. So the famines overall were in plural, with this starting point of horrific one, of which is a sort of not a taboo topic, but so little was known, and so little of a genealogical personal memory was traveling. Communal memory, yes. Stories of cannibalism, stories of all kinds of expected Holodomor experiences have circulated, but personal stories seem to have been blocked. So in this case, comparisons were made, maybe not so much comparisons as foci of villages were shifted away from what their parents have gone through to what followed up. And that was, again, starvation, famine, starvation in the World War II settings. Western Ukraine had its own cluster of challenges, Western Ukrainians to deal with. It was collectivization and Soviet executions of activists and the movement of UPA and so on and so forth. These losses of the 50s for the Western Ukrainians after the war were far closer in memory for the narrators, because they also had some memories, personal memories of these. 1947 stands out because it happened to be in a time when kids were coming of age. And if we all reflect on how we remember what we remember and what aspects of our lives stand out, a lot of our youth perhaps stands out because these were formative experiences that resulted in who we are today. Therefore, these villages were following that very protracted sort of a psychological, if you wish, route of how memory works and what they wanted to remember. They wanted to remember what mattered to them. No comparisons were drawn between Holocaust, partially because this is the setting. We are in small or remote villages working with people who are in their 70s, who do of course watch television, who pay attention to the news, but they were asked about their personal lives, and therefore they were focusing on what was immediately happened to them, to their communities, and they were not as interested in perhaps as comparing to Holodomor experiences to the Holocaust experiences, because they may have not been well versed in those Holocaust experiences to start with. Thank you for asking this question.
I'll read a comment that relates to what you just said. One of our questioners added to her question that she was thinking about the experiences of the survivors of the Holocaust and their children, and how the parents and grandparents protected the future generations, sometimes by not discussing things and sometimes by smothering and hyper parenting. And the questioner believes there are probably many similarities with the after effects of the Holodomor.
Thank you. I must add, though, coming back to this last question, that our project was not focusing on ethnic Ukrainians. And of course, there's a whole variety of personal stories, and there were Jewish farmers interviewed as well. So they were certainly reflecting on their own experiences, not but not in a way that we can compare them how others reflected on the Holodomor, though.
Okay, Natalia, I think we have maybe one more question from Edward Bidaus. Thank you for this interesting presentation. In addition to the villages that were or are small towns, rayon centers, many moved to from the countryside to escape the Holodomor. Can this group of people also be, or have they been a target for interviews?
Thank you. Absolutely correct. So many people have moved, not just simply from rural settings to urban settings, and not only to cities in Ukraine, but also to other Soviet territories in the Far East or in the south of Soviet Union, in the Asian part of it. And some simply moved around Ukraine as well. Those who have been in the villages, we've managed to tap into these pools of populations a little bit as well. But the cities, on the other hand, is something that I think other projects are focusing on. And I am very much on the lookout to see what new projects would be coming out and what new reflections would come from those individuals who have managed to escape the Holodomor. Thank you.
I think we'll call it bring it to an end. I have a few announcements to make, but I would like to thank Natalia Kononenko-Friesen for a fascinating talk, and I think exactly what we needed to launch this conference and frame it going forward. We have a full program over the next 3 days. I'll just mention quickly the next panel. We have a break until 1 o'clock on the East Coast. Panel number 1 is Repression, Resistance, and the Transformation of the Countryside During Collectivization and the Holodomor. We have 2 presentations. The first is given in tandem, Benjamin Dunbar and Raymond Taras, Mode of Production as a Contributing Factor to the Holodomor, a Tentative Analysis, and Olga Bertelsen, Suppressing and Concealing Peasant Resistance in Ukraine During Stalin's Collectivization. We're fortunate that we'll have as a discussant Lynn Viola of University of Toronto, and chairing is Bogdan Klid. And you'll find the Zoom links if you can look on our Facebook page, our website. So that's at 1 o'clock Eastern Time. At 3 o'clock, there is a panel entitled Narrating the Trauma of the Holodomor. Irina Skubi of Queen's University will be giving a talk speaking about food discussed after the famine. What does survivor testimony tell us? And Vitaly Ohienko will be speaking on the Stakhanovites and the Holodomor. Are they connected? And if so, what is the impact on the narrative? The discussant is Dennis Klein of Keene University in New Jersey, and Edward Bidaus will be chairing. Then the last panel of the day. I won't read you all the panels for the next 3 days. I just thought I'd go over today's. At 5 o'clock Eastern time, the panel is entitled, it's panel 3, Everyday Experience of the Holodomor. You can, no offense meant to our speakers, anyone who is interested ought to look at the program and you'll see the 3 speakers we have for that panel. Again, thank you, Natalia. Thank you all for your presence on Zoom today. If we were in a room, I'm sure we would all be applauding, but on behalf of everyone, Natalia, thank you for an engaging and important presentation as we move forward. And there's a question about recording. Yes, they're being recorded and they will most likely be posted on the HREC website at a later date.
Thank you, Marta. Thank you, everybody, for launching this important dialogue. And I wish you all productive conversations in this conference. I'll try to join the events as much as I can, but